And we're finally back with the no pin wash Su-76. In the last video, we did this amazing base coat. This video, it's time to weather. But before I did all that, I needed a break, so what better way to relax than to do some modeling in a different location. Back at the bench, I started sponge chipping with Russian Base Light mixed with a few drops of thinner medium. This way, the edges will look more faded due to the low contrast. I left this build able to be disassembled, which turned out to be a huge headache in the end, but it did allow me to get into tight places with the sponge. After that, I used a dark rust to fill in the middle of the sponge chips. And I let the pattern I already made with the sponge be my guide. This takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. It makes the process altogether more relaxing and much more smooth. In this step, I add a few drops of drying retarder to the dark rust paint. This way, on a long session of chipping, it doesn't dry out, and I don't have to worry about the brush gumming up as much either. Now on to the mud effects. I wanted to try using my pigments again since it's been a few years since I've really tried this effect. And this is actually how I've always used the effect, except at the end I'm going to use some fixer. First off, I wet the surface with isopropyl alcohol to give the pigment something to stick to. After, I manipulate it with a brush, gently of course, as to not disturb the granules. I then flood the surface with isopropyl alcohol again. Using a brush, I can also use this to manipulate the mud further and create some streaks. Once I have everything where I'd like it, and I've done some light stippling, then this time I flooded the entire surface with pigment fixer. Now I've heard that this really solves the problem of the pigments getting all over the place and not staying stuck to the model. Did it work? It was better, but it lost a lot of its light color, so I had to dust on more dry pigment anyway. In doing so, this action knocked off a lot of the nice little detail that I had achieved with the delicate process to begin with. I did like the results for the road wheels since the cleanup for all the contact points can just be rubbed off with your fingers, and that made life a little bit easier. Since I was already committed to this process, I had to smear some of this mixture onto the tracks. But all in all, I don't think I would use this again in the future. I would just stick to the ready-made terrain paste since they are much easier to manipulate and much more durable once they're dry. Then finally, after way too long, I was able to glue this model all together and never take it apart again. Okay, now it is finally time for some no pin wash fun. This is O.P.R, or oil paint rendering, a technique developed by Mike Rinaldi. His channel has so much more info on the topic, so if you'd like to learn more, check out his page for some amazing tutorials. I'll link it below in the description. So, O.P.R, or oil paint rendering, is basically working light to dark, starting with your lightest dust layer, or grime layer, and putting that down and then stippling it out. The paint and brush wetness are critical here. You can see I start out with a little too much thinner, so it ended up being a very light pass. Then I upped the paint to thinner ratio and I got a much better result. Remember, since we do this light to dark, the darker layers go over the layers that are lighter. That means these light layers need to be large enough to cover the entire area you want to get dirty. Use a hairdryer in between each layer to make sure you've locked everything in place. And this is where it becomes a little bit more of an art form, getting that brush wetness consistency, where you're not rubbing off all the oil paints that you just put on, instead blending with a stippling motion the paint into the layers below it. Now this gets tricky because you need the paint to have enough consistency and wetness to blend, but you don't want to use such an aggressive action that you're rubbing all of it away. Once you have that first base layer down though, it is much more like the chipping process with the sponge. You have your roadmap, and now it's just about filling in the darker and darker layers. This is a great way to get mud effects, as you can see here with some streaking, and it also builds up a nice texture. You could use this technique for all sorts of things, but here, since the entire vehicle was going to be dusty, there was really no need to pin wash everything first. Remember, a pin wash changes the tint or gives a filter sometimes to the entire model. So when you work so hard on that base coat, to just cover everything up with a filter or a wash doesn't really make any sense, especially since we're going for a light to dark dust pattern here. And that darker mud built up around all of those fine details does basically the same thing a pin wash does, highlight those areas. So I hope you learned something new, and I hope you'll give this a try. It was a lot of fun, and all you need is some oil paints and some decent brushes. Thanks so much for watching. We are so close to hitting the 5,000 subscriber mark. If you are watching this all the way to this point and you haven't yet subscribed, please do. It would help out the channel immensely, and I would really appreciate it. Till next time, see you later.